we're going to look at two ways to make residual plots in Excel. We're going to use two data sets that we've looked at previously. So the first one is the coral reef data that we've been using in Chapter 5. And the other one is the fast driving data set from Chapter 4 that looked at how fast the car was driving and then what its fuel efficiency was. So how many miles per gallon. So I will meet you over in Excel in the coral residuals tab, and we'll look at those two ways to make this plot. So this is the coral residuals data tab, and this is where we left it the last time we worked with it. And what we're going to specifically look at is the last thing we did on here, where we looked at the X values, the explanatory values, and then the residuals. And we had found that correlation coefficient, which should be 0. That's a property of the least squares regression line. And so I'm going to highlight these. So I have the X-axis, the explanatory variables plotted this way, and then the residuals will be plotted on that vertical axis. And I'll do this by just making a regular scatter plot after highlighting those values. So if you have the residuals, this is a great way to get your residual plot. If you don't, there's another way to do it, and I'll show you that in just a second. So let me put a title on here. We'll just call it residuals plot. So there's the one we made kind of by hand by just having a list of the X values and the residuals and plotting them together. If you don't already have the residuals, you don't want to go to all that work to calculate them just to make this plot. So there's a built-in feature in Excel, and that's back on the data ribbon. So we'll go back there and back to data analysis. So kind of that same thing we were doing a little bit earlier. And remember that the choice you want on here is regression, because that's the name of the chapter that we looked at. So that should help you remember that. And then the biggest trick with this is just to remember that the data is asked for in the opposite order than you might expect. So normally we expect people to ask for X first and then Y. This is asking for Y first and then X. And I don't know why Excel did that, but that's just a thing to keep in mind. Down towards the bottom, there's a section that says residuals. And so you want to check the residuals and the residual plot, and it'll put both of those together for you. And then in the middle is the output option. So the default is that Excel will create a brand new page for you, still within this workbook, with all of the information on it. And that's a perfectly great option. I'm actually going to have it put all of that on this same page so that you can compare the residual plot generated by Excel with the one that we made by just creating the scatter plot of the correct variables. So I'm going to say OK, and it'll give me a little warning here in a second, and I will go ahead and say OK to that too. And then my residual plot always kind of shows up to the right of what's going on. Now when I look at these look exactly the same. They kind of have the same feel and the same scatteredness. And that's what we would expect for the residual plot for this data. We would expect it to be scattered because the original data was really nice and tight fitting to that line. So it had a strong correlation. And so when I look at the residual plot, then I should just see a bunch of scattered dust. All right, so those are the two ways that you can make a residuals plot. We're going to look at that fast driving data now. And on the fast driving data, they actually found the residuals for you. So that speed is your X variable, and the fuel is your Y, or your response, and then the residuals are in that third column. So in order to make the scatter plot the first way we did that, you do need to put those two columns together. So you want to copy the X data, or the explanatory data, and the residuals into their own grouping, and then make that scatter plot. So make the scatter plot that creates the residual plot the first way, and then go through the data analysis and see if you get the same thing. So I'd like for you to go ahead and pause the video and see if you can make the residual plot both ways. Okay, so the first way, if you have the explanatory variable and the residuals, we can just highlight these together. And I will put a scatter plot in here. So there is the first one. And then the other way we can do this is off of the data ribbon in the data analysis package. We choose regression. And let me get everything highlighted. So I'm going to clear the X and Y out so I get nice clean highlights. So the Y is going to be the fuel data. That's what gets highlighted first. And then the X is the speed. And then let's see, I got to find a spot to put everything. Let's put it right there. And give it just a second. And there you go. So we have this same looking plot, whether we did it with the residuals or we just went through the data analysis feature. You're still going to be able to create a residual plot either way. And either of those ways are fine with me for homework, test, or a quiz. Either was fine. So now let's look at this residual plot. So this is curved, which means that our original data is not linear. And so it wouldn't be appropriate to use these techniques that we're using in chapter 5 on this data set. Okay. As you might imagine, I can actually make the original data plot. If you don't remember what it looked like, it's also curved. So let's just put that up there so you can take a look at that. So there's the original one. And that line of best fit kind of went through the middle of those points. And so all that residual plot did was it just dropped that line to flat on the axis and adjusted the points accordingly. All right, so this one's definitely not a linear model.